My name is Willa Farrell, and the final word my father ever spoke to me was, "Go." I was only 11 years old. I stood on the gravel driveway with a worn duffel bag in my hand while my aunt's headlights swept across the yard. My father never even looked back. For the next 20 years, I believed he'd thrown me away as if I were nothing more than spoiled livestock feed. That belief shaped every decision I made. I built my life 3 states away, making sure I never depended on anyone. Then, last August, during my first vacation in 9 years, my phone lit up while it rested on my beach towel. Fly home. Don't tell your parents. I almost laughed because, in my mind, I hadn't had parents since childhood. But the second message mentioned 2 names I never expected to see together, and suddenly it felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. I caught the first flight home that same night. When I stepped off the plane, 2 police officers and a lawyer were waiting at my gate. What they told me dropped me to my knees. The cruelest thing I believed my father had ever done turned out to be the greatest act of love he'd ever shown me. And what my mother did afterward is something I still can't talk about without my hands trembling. Welcome back to Diana True Stories, where the quietest members of a family often carry the biggest secrets. If you've ever lived with a version of your own story that someone else wrote for you, stay until the end. Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe. Before I tell you what happened, you should know who I am. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a large animal veterinarian outside Bozeman, Montana. Most of my emergencies happen around 3 in the morning inside freezing barns. The night before everything changed, I had my arm inside a heifer named Pickle, trying to reposition a calf that had decided to enter the world sideways. The rancher was in tears. His wife was praying. Out of everyone standing there, I was the only calm person within 40 meters. That's usually my role. People don't call me because they enjoy my company. They call because the worst moment of their lives has already arrived, and they need someone who won't panic. That's what I'm good at. I stay steady while everyone else falls apart. The calf was delivered safely, breathing and healthy. The rancher hugged me, and I let him, for exactly 2 seconds, before I started packing my equipment. Growing up the way I did teaches you something strange. You learn how to be useful, like a tool in someone's hand. But you never really learn what it feels like to simply be wanted. I owned a paid-off pickup, a successful veterinary practice, and a kitchen with only 1 chair. My Aunt Ruth always joked that I collected excuses to avoid Thanksgiving the same way other people collected family recipes. She wasn't wrong. For 20 years, I'd convinced myself I didn't need anyone, especially not the family who sent me away when I was 11 and never bothered to write again. I probably would have kept believing that forever if Ruth hadn't rented a beach house for both of us that July and refused to accept any excuse. The Outer Banks during summer felt alive in the best possible way. Ruth's grown children were there, along with their own kids racing across the porch. The air smelled of sunscreen and freshly steamed shrimp. Technically, they weren't my immediate family. Ruth was my father's younger sister. When my dad, Glenn, sent me to live with her at 11, she could have treated me like charity. Instead, she taught me how to drive a tractor, signed every report card, and proudly sat in the front row when I earned my veterinary doctorate. Her family became the only real family I'd ever known. On our 3rd evening together, one of the younger kids innocently asked when I was finally going to visit the famous Nebraska farm, the one with the bright red barn in the old photograph hanging on Ruth's wall. The porch suddenly fell silent. Ruth slowly placed her iced tea on the table. A look crossed her face that I'd only seen a couple of times over 2 decades. It was the expression of someone trying to hold back a storm. "Don't put ideas like that in the child's head," she replied far too quickly before changing the conversation to the upcoming fireworks. I let it go. I'd become very good at letting things go. Still, later that evening, while I washed dishes, I noticed Ruth watching me. Not casually. She looked at me the way someone watches a person who's only moments away from discovering a life-changing truth. I convinced myself I was imagining it. I poured a glass of wine and walked toward the dunes to watch darkness settle over the ocean. Then my phone vibrated against my pocket. I assumed it was my answering service calling with another emergency. Another frightened rancher, facing the worst night of their life. Instead, it was an unfamiliar number. One text message. One sentence powerful enough to tear apart the quiet life I'd spent 20 years building. Fly home. Don't tell your parents. I read those words 3 times. The evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby yard, and suddenly, I wasn't 31 anymore. I was 11 again. It's amazing how a single smell can unlock memories you've buried for years. Back home, that scent had always been fresh-cut alfalfa. The night they sent me away, the entire farm smelled of it beneath a sky slowly turning purple. I'd gone downstairs for a glass of water and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table with her brother, Roy. Bank statements belonging to my grandmother, Nadine, were spread across the table like a poker game. Years later, I'd understand what they were looking at. Roy glanced toward the doorway, saw me standing there, and his expression instantly hardened. He leaned toward my father, who had just come in from the fields, and quietly muttered, "Well, the girls saw everything." The color drained from my father's face. No one explained anything to an 11-year-old. By sunrise, my bag had already been packed. My mother stood on the porch with her arms folded while Ruth's headlights rolled up the driveway. When I asked why I had to leave, she gave me the sentence that haunted me for the next 20 years. "Your father never wanted you, Willa. Nobody did." My father stood beside the truck, wearing his familiar green and black work flannel. His back stayed turned toward me. He didn't turn when I called his name. He didn't turn when I cried. He didn't even turn after the screen door slammed so hard the entire porch rattled. He spoke only one word: "Go." So I did. And for the next 20 years, I believed every word my mother had told me, because that's exactly what an 11-year-old child does. For 20 years, I believed every word my mother told me because that's what children do. They believe their mothers. And not a single person ever reached out to tell me otherwise. Now, standing in the salty breeze with my phone in my hand, someone finally had. I'm not the kind of woman who follows a stranger's instructions without questions. The first thing I did was figure out who had sent the message. I called the number, but it went straight to a generic voicemail with no name attached. Then I ran a reverse lookup. All it gave me was an eastern Nebraska area code, nothing more. I sat down on the cold sand and thought through the situation the same way I'd work through a difficult diagnosis. Whoever had texted me knew my cell phone number, knew I was away on vacation, and knew the word parents would still get my attention. That wasn't an accident. Somebody had done their homework. I texted back, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "It's about your father. Your mother and Roy cannot know you're coming." The moment I saw Roy's name in that message, a chill ran down my spine. 20 years of therapy had never erased the feeling that name carried. This wasn't a prank. No stranger would know about Roy. I got to my feet, brushed the sand from my clothes, and headed back toward the house. The family was still on the porch laughing over a card game. Ruth looked through the screen door, caught my eye, and her expression changed instantly. I didn't tell her anything. The message had warned me not to say a word, and some instinct buried deeper than common sense told me to keep it that way until I understood what was really happening. Right there in the dark, I booked the first red-eye flight from Norfolk to Omaha. I've never been someone who runs from hard situations. Whatever was waiting for me in Nebraska had been waiting for 20 years. I wasn't about to let someone else control what I knew about my own life any longer. During the flight, I had nothing but a layover and too much time to think. I started adding everything up. The people back in Calhoun, Nebraska, already had a story about me. They believed I was a difficult child, that I lied, that I stole, that Glenn and Brenda had done everything they could before finally sending me away to relatives for the family's own peace. I knew that story because I'd gone back once when I was 19. I walked into the local feed store and watched grown adults quietly switch aisles just to avoid me. I didn't waste my breath defending myself. I'd learned early that you can't change the mind of someone who's comfortable believing a lie. So, I chose another path. I stopped trying to convince people who had already judged me. Instead, I focused on something no one could ever take away. I worked my way through school, built my career from the ground up, earned a reputation across 3 counties for honest work and dependable hands. The town could keep believing its version of me. I'd already written a better one with my own life. What I didn't realize, while drinking terrible airport coffee at 2 in the morning, was what was actually waiting for me back home. The family farm covered 400 acres of rich bottomland and had belonged to our family since 1911. My grandmother, Nadine, had managed everything until she passed away 3 years earlier. No one had even bothered to tell me she'd died. Somewhere back there was a will, the old barn, and a complete record of who inherited what. And someone important enough to involve 2 police officers believed I needed to know before it was too late. I'll be honest with you. I wasn't ready to trust a stranger just because they sent convincing text messages. Before letting anyone guide my next move, I decided to check one thing for myself. Standing at the Omaha airport just after 6 that morning, I dialed the old farmhouse number I'd memorized as a child but hadn't called once in 20 years. It rang 4 times. Then, an answering machine picked up. The voice belonged to my mother. She sounded older and colder than I remembered. The recording asked callers to leave a message for Brenda and Roy at the family residence. Roy was living in my grandmother's house. That single recording told me more than any anonymous message ever could. I hung up before the tone. If my mother and Uncle Roy were running the farm together, and someone connected with the authorities wanted me there without either of them finding out, then that warning wasn't paranoia. It was direction. My entire adult life had been spent recognizing danger before anyone else noticed it. A heifer about to kick. A rancher standing on the edge of losing everything. You learn to recognize that feeling. And every instinct I had told me this was exactly that kind of moment. So I straightened my shoulders and headed toward baggage claim. A man wearing a gray suit stood there clutching a folder against his chest, scanning every face that passed. A short distance behind him, 2 investigators waited quietly. The moment he spotted me, he walked over without hesitation. He already knew exactly who I was, which meant he had my photograph and had been expecting me. "Miss Farrell?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the careful kindness of someone used to delivering painful news. "I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." I had traveled nearly 2,000 miles because of a single text from a stranger. I wasn't willing to spend another minute in the dark. The man introduced himself as Tom Beck, my father's attorney for the past 19 years. 19 years. I had never once heard his name before. The 2 people standing with him were investigators from the county attorney's office. He introduced them so matter-of-factly that the word investigators barely registered at first. We were taken into a small airport office with glass walls, a fake potted plant in one corner, and an old clock whose loud ticking filled every silent moment. Tom placed the folder on the table, folded his hands over it, and took a slow breath like a man about to say something he had practiced 100 times, but still dreaded. "Before I explain anything else," he said quietly, "there's one thing you need to understand. Your father did not abandon you, Miss Farrell." I froze. For 20 years, I had carried one sentence inside me, that my father had thrown me away. His words cut straight through every belief I had built my life around. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain calm. Staying composed had become the one skill I trusted above everything else. Tom opened the folder. On top lay a single cream-colored envelope, its corners worn from years of being handled. Across the front, written in handwriting I hadn't seen since childhood but recognized instantly, were 2 words. "For my Willa." It was my father's writing. The pen strokes pressed so deeply into the paper that they nearly tore through it, just like every note he had ever written, as though he believed the words might escape if he didn't anchor them to the page. Tom gently slid the envelope across the table toward me. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The clock continued ticking. One investigator shifted her stance while Tom spoke again, carefully choosing every word. "Your father passed away 6 days ago." The room seemed to tilt. "He left everything to you," Tom continued softly, "and 20 years ago, he sent you away because he believed it was the only way to keep you safe." I barely heard the word safe. My career had been filled with delivering heartbreaking news to other people, in barns, kitchens, and hospital corridors, but I had never imagined being the one who would collapse beneath it. My knees simply gave out. The carpet rushed toward me as everything dissolved into a blur of white noise. It wasn't weakness. I had been awake all night, living on 2 cups of coffee and an empty stomach, and a stranger had just told me that the father I had spent 2 decades believing hated me had actually loved me enough to sacrifice everything, and now he was gone forever. That wasn't weakness. That was grief crashing into me all at once with nowhere to go. When I opened my eyes again, one of the investigators was kneeling beside me, offering a paper cup of water while quietly repeating my name. Tom Beck looked devastated. I shook my head, pushed the cup aside, and pulled myself upright until my back rested against the wall. My aunt is never going to let me forget this, I muttered hoarsely. No one smiled. That was understandable. I took several slow breaths until the room stopped spinning. Then I reached for the only thing that had ever helped me through a crisis, the next undeniable fact. I don't need water, I said. I need the file. I met Tom's eyes. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out, and don't soften the truth. I paused before adding quietly, I've spent 20 years living with softened lies. I'm ready to hear what really happened. Tom took a sip of the water I had refused before explaining the mysterious text message that had brought me home. He admitted it had come from him. He had purchased a disposable phone specifically so neither my mother nor anyone connected to her could trace it. His warning hadn't been dramatic, it had been necessary. My mother, Brenda, and my uncle Roy were both under an active criminal investigation. If either of them learned I had returned before everything was in place, the plan my father had carefully protected for 2 decades could unravel within hours. They could move money, Tom explained. They could influence witnesses. Roy has a long history of persuading people to change their stories. Neither investigator disagreed. I looked directly at them. What exactly are they being investigated for? Tom glanced toward the officers before Detective Pruitt answered. Financial exploitation of an elderly person. She didn't hesitate. Your grandmother, Willa Farrell. The room threatened to spin again, but this time I planted both feet firmly on the floor and refused to let it. Willa had been the one adult in my childhood who made me feel loved. She slipped peppermints into my hand during church services, let me name every barn cat, and treated me like I mattered. They drained her finances, Detective Pruitt said. Over several years. Power of attorney, bank accounts, forged signatures. We've been uncovering pieces of it for a long time. We just didn't have the complete picture. I looked from the investigators to the envelope bearing my father's handwriting. For the first time in 20 years, something inside me that had been buried beneath anger and heartbreak slowly began to rise. The tears would come later. Not here. Not in front of strangers. I lifted my eyes to Tom. You said my father knew, I said quietly. How long had he known? The expression on Detective Pruitt's face told me before anyone spoke that I wasn't going to like what came next. Tom Beck spread several documents across the table. I studied them the same way I examined a medical chart, line by line, searching for the detail that didn't belong. The records showed withdrawals from my grandmother Nane's bank accounts stretching back 11 years. There was a power of attorney she had signed after her eyesight began failing, naming Roy as her agent and my mother as the backup. The money hadn't disappeared all at once. It had been transferred in carefully measured amounts, small enough to avoid attracting attention from the bank. More than $200,000 had slowly flowed into accounts connected to my mother and Roy. My mind automatically shifted into its clinical mode. That was the only reason I managed to stay composed. Then, halfway through the 3rd page, one transaction stopped me cold. A single withdrawal. $12,000. Dated June 18th, the summer I was 11. I didn't just remember that date. I felt it. Detective Pruitt, I said quietly, pointing at the statement. June 18th, that was my grandmother's birthday. We were all at her house that night. Both investigators looked at me. I came downstairs for a drink and saw my mother and Roy sitting at the kitchen table with Grandma's bank papers spread out in front of them. Roy looked at me and said, "The girls saw." I swallowed. The very next morning, I was sent away. Detective Pruitt became perfectly still. She pulled the statement closer. "How long have you had this record?" I asked. "About a year," she admitted. "So, you already had the date and the withdrawal amount." She nodded. "But you didn't have the only person who actually witnessed what happened in that kitchen." For the first time, they stopped looking at me as a grieving daughter and started seeing me as something else. A witness. The bank records proved the money had been taken. I could explain why, when, and what happened immediately afterward. An 11-year-old girl had accidentally seen something she wasn't supposed to see. And by sunrise, she had been shipped 3 states away. Tom Beck closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Your father knew," he said softly. "He suspected the truth before you were 11. But he couldn't prove it. And he couldn't protect you while trying to expose them at the same time." I'd like to tell you that hearing those words filled me with gratitude. It didn't. It made me furious. Not reckless anger. The cold, useful kind I trusted far more than tears. "If he knew," I said, "then answer something for me." Tom waited. He believed I was in danger from his own wife. I leaned forward. "So, why did he send me to Aunt Ruth and disappear for 20 years? No letters. No birthday cards. No phone calls. He let me grow up believing he never wanted me." I held his gaze. So, which was it? Was I really his daughter? Or was I just a problem he stored 3 states away so I wouldn't interfere with whatever plan he was trying to carry out? The investigators lowered their eyes. Tom Beck didn't. It was obvious he'd been expecting that exact question. Something about that irritated me. The way it does when someone understands you better than they should. "Your father told me you would ask that," Tom replied. Almost word for word. He managed a sad smile. He said, "Willa is too smart to be convinced by a heartbreaking story, so don't even try." Tom reached back into the folder. "There's a letter." He wrote it over many years. He finished it this spring after his heart began failing, and he realized he didn't have much time left. He left strict instructions that you were not to receive it, or any of the evidence, until after he died and everything was in place to protect you. Not one day earlier. Tom's voice caught for just a second. He told me, "If she reads it while I'm still alive, I'll lose my nerve. The moment I see my little girl's face, I'll tell her everything, and 20 years of work will fall apart." I clenched my jaw. I still wasn't ready to trust the words of a man who was no longer alive to answer my questions. But I wanted to read that letter more than anything I could remember wanting. Then Tom added something that hit even harder. "Ruth is already on her way to Omaha." That nearly broke me. She had boarded a flight only an hour after mine because Tom had called her the moment I answered his text. Yet she hadn't said a single word while we sat together on that beach porch. When she finally walked into the airport office, 60 years old, gray-haired, and visibly shaking, I stood so quickly my chair scraped across the floor. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. She met my eyes without looking away. "I knew." She took a slow breath. "The week before Glenn put you in my car, he came to see me. He told me everything Brenda and Roy had been doing. Then he made me swear on our mother's memory that I would never tell you the real reason." She wiped her eyes. "He believed that if you knew the truth, you'd come back to fix it. That's who you are. You always try to fix everything. And he was terrified they'd hurt you to keep you silent. He believed the only way to protect you was to make sure you never wanted to come back here." She paused before continuing. "He almost changed his mind. The first Christmas after you left, he couldn't bear the separation anymore. He handed me a Christmas card with nothing inside except his signature and asked me to mail it to you." Her voice cracked. 2 weeks later, Roy stopped Glenn beside the grain bins. He said it was a shame about the little girl staying all the way out at Ruth's place. He even used your name. Ruth shook her head. "Glenn had never told anyone where you were except me. That was how he realized they were watching both our mail. After that, he never sent another letter." Tears finally filled her eyes. "I let you believe that lie for 20 years, Willa. And I've hated myself every single day because of it." She placed a plain banker's box on the table between us. It was sealed with old packing tape. Folded neatly on top was the green and black flannel shirt my father had been wearing the last morning I ever saw him. I recognized it instantly, even after 20 years. "I was told to give this to you," Ruth whispered. He said, "When she opens the box, make sure she's alone because she's going to need to be." I rested my hand on the old flannel. Somehow, impossibly, it still carried the faint scent of him. I took the box to a small motel beside the interstate. After locking the door, I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, just like I used to whenever the world felt too heavy to carry. Inside were only two things: a thick binder and the cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front. I reached for the letter first. I reached for the envelope before anything else. Inside was a 12-page letter, written over many years like a captain's log. The early pages carried my father's firm, steady handwriting. As the years passed, the ink became softer, the strokes less certain, his failing health visible in every line. He described the night I walked into the kitchen. He wrote that Roy had openly warned him, saying they needed to make sure the girl forgets what she thinks she saw. In that moment, my father realized his 11-year-old daughter had become part of something far more dangerous than she could understand. He faced an impossible choice. He could either keep me close or keep me safe. He couldn't do both while gathering the evidence needed to stop them. So he made the hardest decision of his life. He sent me somewhere they couldn't reach me and spent the next 20 years quietly building the case I never knew existed. Near the bottom of the first page was a sentence I've read so many times I could repeat it from memory. "I had to let you hate me, so you could stay alive." The binder wasn't filled with memories or secret recordings. It was proof. Real documents. Certified bank statements obtained through a guardianship petition. A transfer-on-death deed for the family's 400 acres, officially recorded in 2019 with my name listed as the beneficiary. Years of correspondence between my father and Detective Pruitt's office. A revocable trust protecting what remained of Nain's estate, naming me as the rightful heir. My father hadn't loved me with hugs or phone calls. He loved me through legal filings, court documents, property records, 20 years of silent sacrifices that kept me alive. He accepted my hatred so I could stay far away from the people who wanted me gone. Sitting alone on that motel floor, I cried harder than I had in years. Not quiet tears. The kind that come after carrying the wrong story for far too long. I read every page. Then I started over and read them all again. The second time through, the night I was 11 completely changed in my mind. Every memory shifted into place. The bank papers on the kitchen table had belonged to Grandma Nain. I hadn't interrupted an ordinary family conversation. I'd walked into the middle of a crime. Roy's expression. His cold words. The girl saw. Then my father walking in from the fields, still smelling of fresh-cut alfalfa, realizing his daughter had suddenly become a loose end. No parent should ever have to choose between keeping a child nearby and keeping that child alive. Mine did. He gave up everything he wanted so I could have everything I needed. The letter explained why he never looked back that morning. If he'd turned around and seen my face, he knew he wouldn't have been strong enough to let me leave. He would have taken me back inside. He would have fought. And, according to him, neither of us would have survived what followed. So he kept his back toward me. He listened to the screen door slam and forced out the only word he believed he could say without breaking. Go. For 20 years, I'd heard that word as rejection. Now I understood it was the greatest act of love he was capable of giving. The letter also answered every question I'd thrown at Tom Beck. Why no hidden phone calls? Why no birthday cards secretly mailed through Ruth? Because my father had already thought through every possibility. Roy continued watching Grandma Nain's mail. He watched relatives. He paid attention to every unusual detail. A single Christmas card from a father who was supposed to have disowned his daughter would have told Roy one thing immediately. I still mattered. And if I still mattered, he would come looking for me. A real separation had to look completely real. Anything less would have put me back in danger. Reading those pages, I finally understood what Roy had wanted all those years. He didn't want to chase me. A missing granddaughter, would have drawn attention. Police. Questions. Investigations. What he wanted was much simpler. A girl who disappeared quietly. A girl who never came back. A girl who never spoke. For 20 years, I unknowingly gave him exactly that. The danger had never been someone hunting me across the country. The danger was a door. As long as I stayed away, kept silent, and never learned the truth, that door stayed closed. The comment Roy made beside the grain bins hadn't been casual conversation. It had been a warning. We know where she is. Keep her there and she'll stay safe. My father understood exactly what those words meant. So he spent 20 years making sure that door never opened. The legal side of it was just as complicated. He couldn't openly accuse his own wife and her brother while they still controlled Nain's finances through power of attorney. If he acted too soon, they would destroy records, move money, and erase every trail. He needed the financial pattern to become undeniable. He needed the estate process to begin. He needed patience. So he waited. He documented everything. He collected evidence. The moment it became legally safe, he recorded the transfer deed in 2019, all while allowing me to believe he had abandoned me. Because a daughter who hates her father never comes home, and never walks into the trap waiting for her. None of it erased the grief. Nothing could erase the pain of discovering that someone loved you only after they were gone. But it changed where my anger belonged. Not with my father. With my mother. The woman who looked her crying 11-year-old daughter in the eyes and chose the cruelest lie she could possibly tell.
And with Roy.
The man who frightened my father enough to make him sacrifice 20 years with his own child. They were less than 40 miles away, asleep in my grandmother's farmhouse, believing the inheritance was safely theirs. Neither of them had the slightest idea. I was back. The following morning, I met Tom Beck at his office. He carefully explained everything that had happened while I was gone. My father's funeral had been kept small and rushed through as quickly as possible, exactly the way Brenda wanted it, before anyone had time to start asking questions. The reading of the will was next. The reading of the will was scheduled for Friday at the farmhouse, only 3 days away. My mother had insisted it take place there, surrounded by family, the pastor, and a few longtime neighbors. Willa Farrell had never been one to pass up an audience when it came to displaying her grief. She was convinced the 400-acre farm and everything Nain had left behind would soon belong to her. She had even hired her own attorney to prepare the paperwork. Tom Beck quietly slid another document across the desk. 2 weeks before your father passed, he said, your mother had him sign what she told the notary was a simple renewal of the farm lease. In reality, it was a quitclaim deed transferring ownership of the property to her. My pulse jumped, but I forced myself to stay calm. Did it work? I asked. Tom gave a slight smile.
No.
He tapped the paper. You can't transfer property you no longer own. Back in 2019, your father recorded a transfer on death deed naming you as the beneficiary. Once that deed was filed, ownership of the land was already determined upon his death. It doesn't matter what a later document says, and it doesn't matter what anyone claims. She tried to take a farm that legally wasn't his anymore. She just doesn't realize it yet. I sat quietly, letting the truth sink in. I could have remained in Montana, allowed the lawyers to handle everything, and never returned to that house. It would have been the safest option. It also would have been the smallest. I'm coming on Friday, I said. Put my name on the list. Let her think I'm there only to mourn. But I didn't wait until Friday. That Wednesday afternoon, I drove out to the farm, following the same county road I hadn't traveled since I was 19. The fields had already gone through their second alfalfa cutting, and the familiar sweet scent drifted through my truck, pulling memories from the deepest corners of my mind. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, and somehow much colder. Before I even stepped out of my truck, my mother walked onto the porch. 20 years disappeared in a heartbeat. She had grown older, but not softer. She wore black from head to toe, gently dabbing at eyes that showed no real tears. Her grief looked more like a performance than sorrow. Well, she said with a thin smile, look who finally decided to come home. Roy appeared behind her in the doorway, older and heavier, but with the same lifeless eyes. My half-brother Travis stood nearby too. He was 27 now, practically a stranger to me, raised on the story that I had always been the family problem. I calmly explained that I'd come to attend my father's funeral and pay my respects. I could actually see the moment my mother decided I wasn't a threat. Her expression softened into something worse than anger.
Pity.
"You traveled all this way," she said, "for a man who sent you away and never looked back." Then she couldn't resist saying the words she'd branded into me years earlier. "You've always managed to make everything about yourself." Cruelty was the language she spoke best. She looked straight at me and repeated the sentence she'd first spoken on that very porch. "He never wanted you, Willa. Nobody did." The scent of fresh-cut alfalfa filled the air around us, while my father's evidence rested safely inside the binder in my truck. I didn't answer. I simply met her eyes, calm and motionless. "You can come Friday," she said. "Hear the reading of the will, then head back to your animals." "I'll be there," I replied. I wouldn't miss it. As I reached my truck, Travis hurried after me. He looked anxious, like someone who had believed a promise for years and suddenly wasn't so sure anymore. "You really shouldn't have come," he said quietly. There wasn't any anger in his voice, only uncertainty. "Mom and Roy already have everything worked out. Grandma's money, the farm, all of it. They've got the paperwork." "What paperwork?" I asked. With complete confidence, he repeated exactly what he'd been told. 2 weeks before Dad died, he signed the farm over to Mom. A lawyer in Fremont handled everything. It's completely locked down. I kept my face expressionless. So this was the quitclaim deed Tom Beck had warned me about. My mother truly believed it guaranteed her victory. That was important. They weren't pretending to win. They honestly believed they already had. And people who think they've already won usually become careless. They say things cautious people never would. I asked Travis gently, "Did you ever actually see me steal anything? Or lie about anything? Any of the things Mom always accused me of?" He hesitated. "Well, no," he admitted. "I was little. That's just what Mom always told me." Then he stopped talking. It was as if he'd heard his own words from someone else's perspective for the first time. I didn't push him any further. Sometimes all you need to do is plant the seed. Time will take care of the rest. I told him I'd see him on Friday, climbed into my truck, and drove back toward town with the windows down. For the first time since leaving the beach, the grief wasn't the strongest thing I felt. It was something colder, something sharper. The same quiet focus that settles over me before a difficult procedure when I already know exactly where the problem is and exactly what I need to do next. Tom Beck carefully explained exactly where I stood, and just as importantly, where I didn't. He refused to give me false confidence because empty hope only delays disappointment. What I had in my favor was substantial. The transfer on death deed my father had officially recorded guaranteed that the 400-acre farm would pass directly to me when he died, taking priority over both his will and my mother's later quitclaim deed. The trust also placed everything that remained of Nadine's estate in my name. These weren't verbal promises or unfinished plans. They were legal documents officially recorded, stamped, and time-documented back in 2019, years before my mother made her move. Still, Tom Beck warned me not to mistake a strong case for an unbeatable one. "Your mother can still challenge the deed itself," he said. "If she convinces a judge that your father lacked mental capacity in 2019 or that someone improperly influenced him, she'll have a case to argue." He didn't believe such a claim would succeed. My father had completed every document while he was healthy, mentally sharp, and careful to leave a clear paper trail. Even so, litigation was never predictable. "Court is still court," Tom reminded me. "Judges are human." It wouldn't be an effortless victory. There was another reality I couldn't ignore. As Glenn's surviving spouse, Nebraska law entitled my mother to claim an elective share of his estate. She couldn't be completely excluded. On top of that, 2 old joint bank accounts carried both of their names, meaning those funds would automatically belong to her. She wasn't going to walk away quietly. She would hire experienced attorneys, challenge every possible issue, stretch the case out for as long as she could, and eventually recover something. But the farm, the heart of everything, the peace my father had sacrificed 20 years to protect, stood on the strongest legal foundation available. Tom Beck said exactly that. Then, he finished the thought. Strongest doesn't mean guaranteed. He leaned back. A marriage this long and property worth this much can turn into an expensive legal battle. Expect delays. A year, maybe 2, before a judge finally closes the case. He believed the deed would survive. He simply refused to promise it would be easy. My father hadn't already won the war for me. He had simply handed me the strongest cards possible and trusted me to play the rest of the game. He spent years filing ordinary legal paperwork that most people never think twice about. In the end, it was those ordinary documents, not dramatic speeches, that would survive when everything else fell apart. I asked Tom whether my mother had discovered that the farm no longer belonged to her. He shook his head. Not yet. She believes Friday is the day she's finally crowned queen. I pictured her standing in that black dress, rehearsing every tear, completely convinced she was about to inherit everything. I decided not to ruin that illusion. Not until I absolutely had to. Thursday evening, I wandered behind the equipment shed where an old hay rake still sat, the same one my father used to let me ride when I was little. Before I saw him, I heard boots crunching over the gravel. Instantly, the back of my neck tightened the same way it had when I was 11. Roy stopped only a step away, close enough to invade my space on purpose. "You've been stirring things up," he said. "I can smell it." "I'm here for a funeral," I answered. A cold smile spread across his face. "Here's a little family advice," he said. "People who come back to this family don't last long." Glenn learned when to keep his mouth shut. You ought to do the same. Get on a plane and leave. 20 years earlier, that same voice had helped drive me out of my home. Standing there at 31, I finally understood the fear my father had lived with and why he'd made the impossible decision to send me away. I didn't retreat, but I didn't pretend to be stronger than I was either. Instead, I stepped sideways, putting a little distance between us. Then I looked directly at my watch. I spoke loudly enough for him to hear. 5:41, Thursday evening. He frowned. "You just threatened me behind the implement shed," I continued. "I'm a witness in an active investigation, Roy. From this moment forward, every word you say becomes part of an official statement." He froze. That was the instant everything changed. He still had intimidation. I had evidence. He could lean on fear. I could answer with dates, times, reports, and a detective's phone number. Those weren't equal weapons. Mine lasted longer. As soon as I got into my truck, I called Detective Pute before I even pulled out of the driveway. She told me the investigation had advanced far beyond what anyone at the farmhouse suspected. The bank had already identified the suspicious transaction pattern. The guardianship case my father started had officially become evidence. Most importantly, my memory of the June 18th withdrawal, the same night I was sent away, gave investigators the missing connection they needed. Until then, they had only numbers on paper. Now they had a story a jury could understand. Brenda and Roy still believed they were preparing for a simple reading of the will. They had no idea the county attorney was reviewing the exact same records I had been reading. If you've stayed with me this far, you probably know where this story is heading. But stay with me a little longer. Everything that's happened so far leads to what unfolds inside that farmhouse on Friday. That night, Travis called. He didn't have much to say. Friday's will reading was scheduled to take place at the farmhouse, just 3 days away. My mother had insisted it be held there, surrounded by family, the pastor, and a couple of longtime neighbors. Brenda Farrell had always loved an audience whenever she had the chance to display her grief. She was convinced the entire 400-acre farm, along with everything Nain had left behind, would soon belong to her. She had even hired her own attorney to prepare paperwork supporting that belief. Tom Beck slid another document across his desk. 2 weeks before your father passed, he explained, your mother brought him to a notary, claiming he was signing a routine renewal of the farm lease. Instead, it was a quitclaim deed transferring the property to her. I felt my heartbeat quicken but forced myself to stay calm. Did it work? I asked. A faint smile crossed his face.
No.
He tapped the paper. Back in 2019, your father recorded a transfer on death deed naming you as the recipient of the land. Once that deed is recorded, ownership passes to you at his death regardless of any later paperwork or even the will itself. Brenda tried to claim land that legally wasn't his to give anymore. She just doesn't know that yet. I let that sink in. I could have remained in Montana and handled everything through attorneys without ever stepping foot on that property again. That would have been the safer option, but it wasn't who I was. Put my name down for Friday, I said. I want to be there. Let her think I came only to mourn. I didn't wait until Friday to see them. On Wednesday afternoon, I drove down the same county road I hadn't traveled since I was 19. The fields were covered with freshly cut alfalfa, and that familiar sweet scent drifted through my truck windows, carrying memories I thought I'd buried. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, and far less welcoming. Before I even stepped out of the truck, my mother appeared on the porch. 20 years disappeared in an instant. She had grown older, but not softer. Dressed completely in black, she dabbed at eyes that produced no tears. Well, she said, look what the wind dragged back. Roy appeared behind her, heavier now with gray in his hair, though his expression hadn't changed at all. My half-brother Travis stood inside as well. He was 27, practically a stranger to me, raised his whole life believing I was the family's problem. I calmly explained that I'd come to attend my father's funeral and pay my respects. I watched my mother decide I wasn't a threat. Her expression shifted into something even worse than anger.
Pity.
Honey, she said, you traveled a long way for a man who sent you away and never bothered looking back. Then she delivered the same sentence she'd branded me with 20 years earlier. He never wanted you, Willa. Nobody did. The smell of alfalfa surrounded me while my father's evidence sat safely inside the binder in my truck. I didn't argue. I didn't reveal what I knew. I simply looked at her with the stillness of frozen water. She smiled. Come Friday, hear the will, then go back to your animals. I wouldn't miss it, I replied. As I reached my truck, Travis hurried after me. He looked uneasy, like someone who had been promised an easy future that was suddenly becoming uncertain. You really shouldn't have come, he said quietly. Mom and Roy already have everything settled. The land, Grandma's money, all of it. They've got the paperwork. What paperwork? I asked. With complete confidence, he repeated the story he'd been told. 2 weeks before Dad died, he signed the whole farm over to Mom. A lawyer in Fremont handled everything. I kept my face perfectly still. So this was the quitclaim deed Tom Beck had warned me about. They weren't bluffing because they knew they were lying. They were bluffing because they honestly believed they'd already won. That made them dangerous, but predictable. People who think victory is guaranteed become careless. They say things they would normally keep hidden. I asked Travis another question. Did you ever actually see me steal anything? Or lie the way Mom always said I did? He blinked. Well, no, he admitted. I was just a little kid. She told me those things. He paused. She told me a lot of things. Then he stopped talking. It was the expression of someone hearing his own beliefs from the outside for the first time. I didn't push him. Some truths need time to grow. You'll see me Friday, I said. Then I drove back toward town with the windows down. For the first time since receiving that mysterious message on the beach, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt the calm, focused certainty that comes just before handling the hardest case of my life, when I already know exactly where the problem is and exactly what needs to be done. Detective Pute calmly announced that the gathering was no longer just about settling an estate. There was also an active investigation into the financial exploitation of Willa Farrell, and anyone present might want to speak with legal counsel before making further statements. No one was handcuffed. Real investigations don't unfold like television dramas. Instead, she quietly placed certified bank records beside my father's recorded deed and explained that investigators had recently confirmed a crucial date through the testimony of a witness who had been inside the house the very night everything began. Everyone in the room knew exactly which date she meant. My mother's lips parted, but no words came. Roy immediately headed for the door. Detective Pute's partner followed him without rushing, never breaking stride. Then my brother Travis, who had spent his entire life believing the story told about me, stepped away from the wall by the window and stood in the middle of the room. He looked toward the neighbors, the pastor, and our mother. "The only thing I know for sure," he said, his voice trembling, "is that Mom always told me Willa was a thief. But I never once saw any proof."
He never looked at me.
He didn't have to. He wasn't asking me to forgive him, nor was he suddenly choosing my side. He was simply a man who could no longer carry a lie inside his father's home. The pastor slowly rose from his chair. The neighbors began whispering among themselves. Right there, in front of the very audience my mother had spent 20 years trying to convince, her carefully built story finally collapsed. Tom Beck closed the folder. "That concludes the reading," he said quietly. Silence settled over the room. The scent of fresh alfalfa drifted through the open screen door, while my father's name remained written across the documents on the table. In that moment, I realized I hadn't recovered the 20 years I'd lost. No one ever gets those years back. But at last, the truth was standing in the room, and it wasn't leaving wrapped inside my mother's version of events. People always ask how stories like this end. So here's the honest answer. The farm legally became mine, and nothing my mother filed afterward changed that fact. As Glenn's surviving spouse, she exercised her legal right to claim an elective share of the remaining estate, and she received what the law allowed. Just as Tom Beck predicted, her attorneys stretched every legal process, making it long, difficult, and expensive. Roy's case was formally forwarded by the county attorney, while the investigation into the financial exploitation continued to move through the legal system, slowly and methodically, with no guarantees and mountains of paperwork. Life didn't hand me a perfect ending. What I received instead was something far more valuable. The truth was officially on record. And the farm I never imagined I would someday call my own. I stayed in Nebraska for 2 weeks after the funeral to settle everything. On my final evening, I walked alone across the bottomland beneath the golden light of sunset. 400 acres of alfalfa stretched before me, land my father had spent years protecting through both sacrifice and the legal system. I wore his old green and black work flannel that Ruth had saved for me. Just like when I was little, it still hung loosely across my shoulders. I climbed onto the tailgate beside the field and unfolded the final page of his letter once again. It was the page he'd written near the end of his life, where the handwriting shook. He had signed it simply, "Your father, who never stopped loving you." The pain never disappeared. I don't believe it ever completely will. But sitting there, wearing his jacket, standing on his land, with his words resting in my hands, I finally understood something I had waited 20 years to learn. I was exactly where he had always wanted me to be. Home. Safe. The next morning, before leaving, I saw my mother one last time. She stood on the same porch where she'd condemned me when I was 11 years old. She started talking about family. She warned me I'd regret cutting her out of my life. She accused me once again of being ungrateful. I never raised my voice. "You don't get to tell this story anymore," I said quietly. "The records tell it now." Then I walked down the steps. For the first time in my life, I reached back and gently let the screen door close behind me. The way you close a door you'll never open again. Some parents show their love with hugs, birthdays, and phone calls. Mine showed it through silence, through legal documents, through 20 years of letting me believe he hated me, so I could stay alive. And if I could choose between every acre of that farm and hearing that old screen door close softly behind him just one more time as he came in from the fields, I'd choose him. Without hesitation. That is my story. It all began with one unexpected message on a beach, and a father willing to become the villain, so his daughter would never have to grow up beside the real monsters. If this story reminded you that the quietest people are often the ones protecting us the most, don't wait. Call someone you love today, while they're still here to answer. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.